In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hello, everyone. This is Father Stephen Allen, and this is class 45 of our Orthodox Survival course. And our class today has a long title. It's part of our section that we're calling Faith Comes First. This is session 4 of Faith Comes First. And we're on the 20th century apostasy, part 2. Part 2 is about Russia. And the title is, A Third Rome Has Arisen, and a Fourth Shall Not Be. Russia and the End of the World, Part A. So it's a long title because we're in Faith Comes First, and then we're talking about the apostasy in the 20th century. And in our last class, we talked about the apostasy of the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the other patriarchates. And specifically now we're going to have a section where we talk about Russia. I want to thank our donors, my donors. May the Lord reward your love with His grace. I really appreciate it. And to our other listeners, please consider a gift to help me out. I do need some financial help because our little parish can't support me entirely, although they try very valiantly to support me. If you have PayPal, you can send a one-time gift or a recurring gift of X amount per month, although I haven't figured out how to do that exactly in PayPal. I'd like to ask some advice, but someone asked me how to set up a recurring gift, and frankly, when I went in to try to figure it out, I don't know how. So if anyone wants to write me a note to help me out and figure out how to do that, I'll appreciate it. So if you can help me through PayPal by sending a gift to frstevenallen@gmail.com. Or if it's a larger amount and you want to receive a receipt for tax deduction, contact me at my email that I've just given, and I can tell you how to donate it to our parish, and our parish treasurer will send you a receipt. I'd also like to contact a young man who wrote me. I don't want to say his name in public, but if you're listening, you know who you are. He wrote me a beautiful letter, a handwritten letter, because he was trying to escape the great stereopticon and not do it on the internet. So he wrote me a handwritten letter, and it was a beautiful letter, and I really appreciated it. And then, like a inattentive person that I am, I tossed, just sort of as a force of habit, I tossed the envelope in the wastebasket and kept a letter. But then his letter didn't have his return address. It was obviously I had to have kept the envelope to have his return address. So my young friend, you know who you are, and if you're listening to this, and please write me again and give me your return address, or you can go into the labyrinth of the internet and use an email or even gasp Facebook message and tell me who you are and your address so I can respond to your beautiful and frankly inspiring letter that you wrote to me. So if you're a young man who wrote a handwritten letter to me and you never got a response, and you're listening to this, you know who you are, and now I've explained why I haven't written back, so please contact me and so I can respond. So today we're going to start talking about the Russian Church, which is a big subject. Years ago in my Russian parish in Denver, Colorado, we had a visitor from Texas, and he was talking to one of my church readers who was from Russia. And the Texan said, in a typical Texan fashion, he said, well, Texas is big. And our friend just looked at him and smiled and said, Russia is bigger. Of course, that's an understatement. Russia is huge. It's 1/6 of the world's surface, of the surface of the dry surface of the world. And so it's a very big subject. My own background is that I was ordained in the Russian Church abroad. And in 1985, I was ordained a priest at the Synodal Cathedral of the Russian Church abroad in New York, in Park Avenue in New York. I was ordained by Bishop Gregory Grabe, who was at that time at the very end of his very long tenure as Chancellor of the Russian Church abroad. It was just a few weeks after the repose of Saint Metropolitan Philaret, who reposed on the Feast of the Holy Archangels, 8/21 November 1985, and I was ordained on 27 November Old Style, December 10th, which is the feast day of the Synodal Cathedral, Our Lady of the Sign, the Kursk icon, in the presence of the icon. And so I'll always look back on my days in the Russian Church abroad with great gratitude. I was a priest in the Russian Church abroad from 1985 to 2000, and I still consider myself totally unworthy and totally blessed to have been part of the Russian Church abroad. And even though I've now been in the Greek Old Calendar Church longer, I was a Russian priest, so to speak, from 85 to 2000, and then in 2000 to now, 19 years, I've been in the Greek Old Calendar Church. But it's like a child who's imprinted early in life. No matter where you go through life, that early childhood imprinting or training always is the deepest layer, the a determining factor inside of you. And so really, even though I love my Greek parishioners and I'm a loyal clergyman of the Greek Church, on the inside I'm a Russian. Spiritually, in terms of Orthodox ethos, style, thinking, outlook, I was completely trained by the Russians. And I'll always be grateful for that and grateful to them. I can never be grateful enough to them. Also, to explain my background further, I was never obviously never an important or central person or a high-ranking clergyman in the Russian Church abroad. I was a marginal, stupid convert clergyman, just trying to figure things out and trying to serve the church as best I could. So I don't claim to be a mover and shaker or an important person in the Russian Church abroad. Just a grateful son of the Russian Church abroad. And also there's this question of my Russian language skills. When I was involved in controversies in the 1990s, which were leading up to the eventual confiscation of the Russian Church abroad by the Moscow Patriarchate, I was accused by some people of stepping over my bounds or not having any credibility because my Russian language skills were so poor. I only spoke conversational Russian at a lower level and could not read a lot of sources in Russian. And so they said, well, you don't know what you're talking about, you're not a Russian, you don't speak Russian. And on the one hand, I acknowledge that, yes, of course, it's important to be able to read many sources in the original language, and I'll talk about that later on. But on the other hand, their argument was not valid because there were many non-Russian speakers and total, goofy American convert guys who couldn't read Russian, didn't understand Russian. I understood much less Russian than I did, who could not serve in Church Slavonic, and who were just bumpkin American convert dude priests, who were enamored of the Moscow Patriarchate, and just were flipping out over troikas and snow bells and golden domes and the whole Russian fairy tale scene. And then on the other hand, there were people who were thoroughly, and these guys totally disagreed with me and said I was wrong, and they were all in love with the Moscow Patriarchate and world orthodoxy, and the whole, they wanted to join the big party and be part of the big scene. And then there were people who were totally Russian, utterly Russian to their fingertips, or cultured, educated, pious Russians who totally agreed with me and even would write and call me to say that they agreed with me and that they thanked me for things that I was saying. So I guess it's not whether you're Russian or non-Russian, Russian-speaking, non-Russian speaking, it's where you come down on the side of these important issues. I remember a call I got once I wrote something in English, was translated into Russian. Then one of the Russian bishops called me, and it kind of hesitatingly said, is this Father Stephen? And I said, it's all right, Vladika, говорю по-русски немного, можем поговорить по-русски, I speak Russian a little bit, we can speak in Russian. And he went on to say, it was so funny, his artless, then he gave me a totally artless insult. He said, what you wrote was so good, he said. I couldn't believe an American could write such a good thing. Because of course I just had to laugh, because his artless, contempt for American culture and the American mind vis-a-vis orthodoxy. So that's just a little background about me. I'm not an expert in Russia. I'm a loyal clergyman in the Greek Church, but I am a product of the Russian Church, and to the extent I have any orthodoxy inside of me, to the extent I adopt an Orthodox worldview, it's due to the Russians. and I'll always be grateful to them. But I was not an important or central figure in the Russian Church abroad, and I need to refer you to men who know more Russian than I do and who have tried to bring more original Russian sources to the English-speaking audience. But I'm going to talk about them later on. They're both kind of controversial, and I'm probably going to get pounded for talking about them, but that's the way it goes. So the more I've tried to prepare this talk, the more I realize that we have to take a long time with it. Because, Russia is big. Russia is big. And so it's just too big a subject. So please forgive me if I kind of go on and on about Russia. It's something I know much more about than I know about the other national churches or patriarchates. And so, for one thing, I just know more about it, so I'm going to talk more about it. That's just the reality of the situation. And the other is I feel deeply about it. Right, it's like I said, it's my mother. So when you talk about your mother, you get more animated, right? So the title, this part of our title, this expression, "A third Rome has arisen and a fourth shall not be," it's a famous expression of the monk Philothe of Pskov, who wrote a letter to Ivan III, Tsar Grand Duke of Moscow, Ivan III, early in the 16th century. He said, "So know, O pious king, that all the Christian kingdoms came to an end and came together in a single kingdom of yours. 2 Romes have fallen, the third stands, and there will be no fourth," or more poetically, "a fourth shall not be," right? "No one shall replace your Christian tsardom." So this is the famous Third Rome ideology or Third Rome theory regarding the Muscovite state and Russia considered in general as Orthodox Russia. Now, I'm not here to debate the Third Rome ideology. Many Orthodox don't like the Third Rome idea, but we have to say that practically, we have to admit, any fair-minded historian, Orthodox or non-Orthodox, has to admit that functionally the Muscovite state in the second millennium served as the Byzantium or the Rome of Orthodoxy. There's no getting around this. You can, no matter how much you might be attached to the ecumenical patriarchate and its claims and its ideology, you'd have to be awfully stubborn to reject the evidence that in the second millennium Russia is the great Orthodox nation. There's no getting around it. And I'm not saying that because I'm a Russophile, though I am. I'm saying because it's just the reality. Now, some of you listening to this talk may not know much about Russian history. I know a lot of my fellow Greco calendarists are listening to this, and naturally your focus has been, I hope your focus has been on loving your own people and studying Byzantine history and Greek history, and you should, and that's your duty, all right? You don't get into xenomania, where you're just fascinated with other people and not studying Byzantium and Greece, because if you're a Greek, that's your duty. You've got to do that, and you've got to love Byzantium, you've got to love Greece. But you may not be aware of Russian history very much, and non-Greeks as well, who may not have studied Russian history that much. And a problem is that we don't have a good, comprehensive, cover-to-cover, A to Z book of Russian history from a truly Orthodox standpoint, to introduce the English only, like, all of us dumb Anglophones who are monolingual, don't speak other languages because we're, Anglo-Saxon barbarians, to introduce us dumb Anglos to, or just non-Russian speakers in general, to Russian history from an Orthodox viewpoint. There is an important Russian history written by Dr. Nikolai Dmitrievich Talberg. Dr. Talberg was a pre-revolutionary intellectual who, after the revolution, came to the immigration and ended up teaching at Jordanville, the Holy Trinity Seminary in Jordanville, New York, until his repose in 1967. And if there's any volunteer out there who wants to translate Dr. Talberg's Russian history and Russian church history, I believe he wrote a history of Russia and a history of the Russian church. His work is at Jordanville, in Russian, and it's also archived at the Hoover Institute at Stanford. And I've got the link here in the notes if anybody's interested. It's just a list. The link is to the list of his works that are archived on microfilm at the Hoover Institute at Stanford. So if you have any volunteers out there, good, competent Russian speakers who are also decent English stylists, or if you're not a decent English stylist, rough it out and send it to me, and I'll work on it to turn it into good English, because it's a very important work. So Dr. Talberg's Russian. It's written from a traditional Orthodox and traditional Russian monarchist viewpoint, and which is the valid viewpoint, because that's what Russia really is. The true Russia really is profoundly traditionally Orthodox and monarchist and nationalist, and we're going to get to that later on. So if you're like me, you're a dumb monolingual Anglo, and you need some introduction to Russian history, there is a well-known book by a man named James Billington called The Icon and the Axe. But remember, James Billington is a Western establishment, so-called mainstream historian. You don't read this book for his interpretation. Remember, it has a slant. And when you read books, you look for the slant in a way. You look for the slant in adjectives they use to describe things. Or subtle little digs, at the culture that they're criticizing. And so Billington's book will be full of this, or is full of this. I've read it a couple of times. And so remember, he's a Western establishment historian. The typical Western historian who's a quote-unquote expert on Russia, who's actually hates Russia, okay? But and hates the real Russia. I mean, he claims to love Russia, but he hates the real Russia. So you have to read the book, or I shouldn't say hate. Let's say he doesn't understand it, all right? It's a decent introduction. The Icon and the Axe. It's the introduction to Russian history, and especially the history of the second millennium, right, of Muscovite Russia, which is what we're primarily concerned with. But you read it for the data, not for the interpretation. Then there's a beautiful book by another non-Russian, Suzanne Massey. You may have heard of the book Nicholas and Alexandra by Robert and Suzanne Massey. Sadly, they were divorced later on. Massey, Mr. Massey, Dr. Mr. Massey, has also written a well-known book about Peter the Great. Suzanne Massey is a genuine Russophile. She really loves Russia, and her book is called Land of the Firebird, and it's a beautiful, kind of lyrical, beautifully illustrated, and sympathetic introduction to Russian culture. It's not an Orthodox book. It's just a book by a secular writer who loves Russia. And it's an interesting book. The Land of the Firebird by Suzanne Massey, Massie. Right? And also, if you want to read her husband Robert's book on Peter the Great, it's an interesting book. Again, from a secular Western historian's viewpoint, not from an Orthodox viewpoint. So remember, these are neither Orthodox nor culturally traditional sources, right? So you read them to begin your study, to get introduced, to at least get the outline, the chronology, basic aspects of Russian history and culture, not for your interpretation. For interpretation, you have to delve more deeply into traditional Orthodox, traditional Russian sources, which we're going to talk about. So let's assume. I don't assume that I don't assume that. I shouldn't say any. I don't assume that all of you have an outline of Russian history at your fingertips. So I'm going to give an outline of Russian history in a couple of minutes. And so this is absurdly, ridiculously simplified, right? So this is not an academic lecture on Russian history. This is just, like the series, something for dummies, accounting for dummies, mathematics for dummies. So this is Russian history for dummies, including myself. Okay. So a brief outline of Russian history. We know that Saint Vladimir was baptized in 988 by missionaries from Constantinople. And there's the most important early work describing all this is called a work called the Primary Chronicle. The Primary Chronicle, written by monastic authors. It talks about Russia, the pagan prehistory of the Rus, and their conversion in the early centuries of the Russian Christian culture. And at the same time, the 10th and 11th centuries, 12th centuries, you have the rise of the northern city-states, most prominent of which is Novgorod the Great, which becomes a very important religious, cultural, and commercial center in Great Russia, or Northern Russia. And then we have, of course, in the Middle Ages, we also have the Tatar disruption. I say disruption, sometimes we talk about the Tatar yoke, but it's a mistake to think that the Russians were under the Tatars in the same way that the Balkan people were under the Turks. The Tatars didn't rule them really. They would come in, kill, burn, destroy, pillage, demand tribute, but they stayed to themselves. And then would periodically come and terrorize everybody and force the Russian princes to be their vassals. But it was not as thoroughgoing a domination as we see in the former lands of the Byzantine Empire and the Turks. So there's that period. Then in the 14th century, we have the rise of the Muscovite state. And this is identified most of all with the great figure of St. Sergius of Radonezh, who reposes in 1392. 25 September, Old Style, 1392. And so with St. Sergius of Radonezh, we have the beginning of what's called, and what Billington accurately calls monastic colonization, and this is described also in the Northern Thebaid book we're going to talk about, where the monks would go out into the wilderness, they establish a monastery, they'd try to get away. It's a classic story also, of course, from the Byzantine period, where an ascetic goes in the wilderness to get away from it all, to serve God in solitude, and then monks come and gather around him, and then the villages gather around them, and it's becomes a whole civilization or culture or society with monastic roots, Orthodox, prayerful, liturgical, hesychastic, monastic roots for an entire culture. So this is the spread of the colonization of northern or Great Russia, where the people go out into the wilderness and then establish villages and then towns and cities and so forth. It's all tied to monasticism. So this rise of Muscovy goes on, and then of course in the 16th century you have the apogee of the Rurik dynasty, the original dynasty, with the reign of Ivan Grozny, right, Ivan the Terrible or Ivan the Awesome, Ivan the Fourth, John the Fourth, who is the first Grand Duke of Moscow to be called Tsar, Caesar, and but then after with the death of Ivan the Terrible, then you have the time of troubles in the late 16th and early 17th century, and then the emergence of the Romanov dynasty beginning in 1613 with the election of Michael Romanov as Tsar. And then you have the 17th century, the early Romanovs, right prior to Peter the Great, and then the great tragedy of the 17th century, which is the Patriarch Nikon, who meant well. That was one of those great men of history who meant well, but was kind of rough. And his church reforms triggered what's called the Old Believer Schism, which we don't have time right now to go into. But the Old Believer Schism was not simply a religious schism, but it was part and parcel of a cultural bifurcation in Russian society. It begins in the 17th century as a religious schism, but then with Peter the Great, at the end of the 17th, the beginning of the 18th century, with Peter the Great's aggressive and violent, I would almost say predatory, imposition of Western culture on the Russian people, the Old Believer Schism becomes something much bigger, which is a whole bifurcation or a split in the Russian society, where you have both the Old Believers, and then you also have the Nikonian, or New Rite Russians, but who are still nevertheless patriarchal, traditional, old-fashioned, versus the westernized aristocracy and intelligentsia, which is a terrible, tragic bifurcation, a split, a schizophrenia in Russian society that goes right up to the revolution, and really in many ways continues until this day. So with Peter the Great, you have the 18th century westernization, culminating in the reign of Catherine the Great. Of course, they were both great in the sense of worldly accomplishment, but from our Orthodox point of view, they weren't so great. right? Because they really, to a great extent, they de-orthodoxized Russian society. And then we have a pivotal figure in Tsar Paul at the beginning of the 19th century, who starts to turn back to, at least among the czars, the royal family, if not the aristocracy, a turn back to a traditional or Orthodox way of looking at things. And then the 19th century renewal, which we've talked about briefly in earlier classes, beginning with the reign of Tsar Alexander I, the defeat of Napoleon, the Russia playing a leading role in conservatism in Europe, and then also more importantly, at the heart of it all, the spiritual revival of Russia in the 19th century, under the leadership of monastic figures, and most notably Optina Monastery, and people related to them. But despite the spiritual renewal, this bifurcation intensifies, right? And in the 19th century, you had the opening shots of the revolution, where assassinations, the dreadful assassination of Tsar Alexander II. So already in the second half of the 19th century, you have open moves of the revolutionaries to overthrow the Orthodox and monarchist Old Russia. And of course, then there are the 1905 and 1917 revolutions, the Civil War from 1918 to 1922, and the birth of that monster called the Soviet Union. And so there's the whole Soviet period leading right up to the fall, or you might say the rebranding or whatever, of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. You have the 1990s, which we can call Yeltsin's post-Soviet Russia 1.0, which is the period of the looting of Russia, and the Western, so-called Western, are primarily Jewish oligarchs, right, both inside and outside of Russia, almost destroyed Russia. They almost achieved their centuries-old goal of destroying Russia altogether. They certainly looted it for all it was worth. But then this figure of Putin appears in the early 2000s and rebuilds the country economically and militarily. And so now we have post-Soviet Russia 2.0, which is, for all of its good and bad points, which we'll discuss at a later time. All right, so that's the Cook's tour of Russian history. But now let's talk about the place of Russia in sacred history, because that's our concern today. We are part of a sacred history, begun in the Old Testament and extending through the New Testament, and the history of the church until now. We're still part of that sacred history. That sacred history is going to go on to the end of time, right? And we have to see what's our part in that history. And a fundamental principle of our Orthodox survival course has been that we have to understand all history through this lens of God working out His plan through history. And of course, in the history of the church, we had the catacomb period of the first 300 years. And then the Constantinian period, which began with the conversion of St. Constantine, where the church becomes this dominant force in society. And in the first millennium, we have Rome, both Old Rome and then New Rome, Constantinople, right? And the baptism of the ancient Eastern lands that had been conquered by Alexander the Great, that whole sphere of the world, that whole part of the world, and then the Christianization of the Western barbarians by Old Rome. So this whole glorious spread of the church in the first millennium. And then in the second millennium, in Orthodoxy, we have the tragedy of the Turkish yoke in the Balkan countries, and the former Byzantine territories, and also the former Byzantine territories that were carved up by Western powers, right, under the domination of Crusaders or Italian city-states or the Habsburgs. And then so there are the enslaved Orthodox nations, right, in the Balkans, the former Byzantine territories, and then there's Russia, which is the great independent Orthodox power of the second millennium. So whatever have been the failings of the related Russian peoples, and there are three great Russian peoples, right? The Great Russians, the Little Russians are Ukrainians, and the Belarusians, but also not three, there are more than three, because they're also the Carpatho-Russians, or Ruzan or Ruthenian people. So whatever have been the failings of Russians in general, or the Muscovite state in particular, the big picture is that after the fall of Constantinople, Moscow really did function as Third Rome. Whether you believe in Third Rome ideology or not, okay, historically you have to admit that it did function as a Third Rome, or the center of the great Orthodox empire that existed in the second millennium. This does not mean that I'm not advocating the idea that the Russians are the holiest or best Orthodox people in some absolute sense, right? Every Orthodox nation has saints and sinners. Personally, my opinion currently is that the most intact Orthodox culture is among Romanian people, especially in Moldavia and Bessarabia, or Bessarabia is now called Republic of Moldova. But among those people, it's probably where you have the most intact Orthodox culture, and perhaps you can't put a number on things like this, but I would say, if I had to guess, the highest percentage of truly pious people among the Romanians. So I'm not saying the Russians always have been, and will be the greatest or holiest Orthodox people in the sense of their spiritual achievement. Every nation has its faults. But what I mean by Third Rome is that providentially Russia functioned as the great temporal power in the Orthodox world, right? So in the second millennium. So now we didn't emphasize the history of Russia per se in our earlier survey of the second millennium in our Orthodox Survival course, because our main concern, as was Father Seraphim's in his Orthodox Survival course, his main concern and ours from the High Middle Ages to the Enlightenment period was actually with the West. We were trying to explain developments in the West from an Orthodox point of view. But then recall that when we arrived at the 19th century, we did return to the East, and we discussed in particular the spiritual renewal of Russia that began with St. Paisi Velichkovsky and his disciples in the 18th century. And also we discussed the dramatic bifurcation between the secularized society created by Peter the Great and his successors, and then on the one hand, and then Holy Russia, right, on the other hand. I think everyone would agree that the fall of Orthodox Russia to the Bolsheviks ended the Constantinian period of world history in which the Christian church was the dominant influence in European society, and then by extension this dominant influence in the whole world because of the European influence in the whole world. Right? Many holy men, both before and after the Bolshevik Revolution, saw the Bolshevik Revolution as a prelude to the reign of Antichrist, or as a kind of calling the Bolsheviks Antichrist, or Lenin or Stalin Antichrist. We do not know, okay, I'm not claiming that I have a scientific knowledge, that the Antichrist and the Second Coming are imminent. Although people are talking about it now all the time, right? But we are commanded by our Lord to read the signs of the times. Jesus Christ himself said, try to read the signs of the times. And it is obvious that whether or not the world is going to end in the near future, in our lifetime or our children's lifetime, the dispensation of the reign of the saints, the 1,000-year reign of the saints in the apocalypse, which the fathers interpret as the period of the church's flourishing in society, right? So the 1,000-year is a symbolic number in the scriptures, meaning a long time or a significant period of time. And by the reign of the saints is meant the period in which the church produced countless or millions of saints, and which the church was a dominant influence in society. So this dispensation of the reign of the saints, the Constantinian period, has, if it's not ended forever, it's at least been very decisively interrupted, right? And it's given way to a period of history dominated by a global Luciferian elite. So it's an elite that they've got their hands around everybody's throat in the whole world, and they're Luciferian, right? They're whether we're talking about we've talked about this already, right? Whether it's the banking or financial elite, the corporate elite, the government elite, media elites, educational elites, journalistic elites, so forth and so on. All these elites, all the elites that dominate the world today are Satan-worshipping Luciferians, right? There are no two ways about it, right? People keep denying that, saying these are conspiracy theories. Well, the evidence mounts and mounts and mounts, and you can't deny it. And if you go back and read Father Seraphim's notes carefully, going back to his discussion of the French Revolution, you'd see that this is what he was pointing to in his lectures at that time. So we're in this period dominated by this Luciferian elite, but Russia's past, present, and future are providentially at the center of this great drama. Whatever's going to happen in the world, Russia's right in the middle of it, right? And we would do well to discern what is going on in the Church of Russia, both in the Russian land and in the diaspora. So we by the end of this series of lectures on Russia, we want to have some kind of discernment of what's going on in the Russian Church now, right? But to do that, we have to back up and have to give some background. So just now I gave this Cook's tour of Russian history from the secular viewpoint. So we've given our Cook's tour of the secular history of Russia, so to speak, or from a secular viewpoint. But we have to remember that the true history of any nation is a spiritual history. We know that our warfare is not against flesh and blood, as St. Paul writes, but against the fallen angels, what does it say, the principalities and powers in high places, right? So the more important part of the history of the church and of the world and of every Christian nation and every soul, the real history is the invisible history of spiritual life. That's true of each of us, right, in our spiritual lives and the lives of families, nations, and societies, right? So as a background to understanding the significance of Muscovite Russia in history, we have to see its outward history, okay, in light of its spiritual history. Its outward history in light of its spiritual history, which is the history of its saints. Okay. Now, when I say Muscovite Russia, of course, I'm talking about the polity dominated by Moscow, by the czars, right? I'm not taking a side, a little footnote. I'm not taking a side in the Ukrainian controversy. Okay, I don't have a dog in that fight about whether Ukraine should be incorporated under the current Russian Federation or not. I understand and I sympathize with both those who advocate a more imperial Russian approach and those who advocate nationalism for the smaller nations such as Ukraine, Belarus, and so forth. So I don't really have a dog in that fight. I'm just talking about the history of Muscovite Russia because that polity and the culture it represented was the dominant Orthodox power in the second millennium. Okay. So to understand its outward history, we have to understand its spiritual history, which is the history of its saints. The real history of any nation, of any Christian nation, is the history of its saints. So I recommend that you do a course of reading on this spiritual history of Russia that consists of certain books I'm going to name. These aren't the only books, but it's enough, certainly, to get you started. And so I'm going to give this in this spiritual reading list in a chronological order that covers Russian history, beginning with the time of St. Sergius of Radonezh, in chronological order. And a book to start with would be, if you can get it, The Acquisition of the Holy Spirit in Ancient Russia by I.M. Kontsevich, Ivan Mikhailovich Kontsevich. If you've read books from Platina, read articles by Father Seraphim Rose, so forth, they talk about Dr. Kontsevich. He was a friend and collaborator of theirs. He reposed rather prematurely in the 1960s. So this is his magnum opus. It's about the roots of Russian civilization in the hesychastic tradition of the Greek fathers, as passed on to the great Russian ascetics. So Kontsevich's thesis is extremely important because there are modernists and relativists in 20th century Russian philosophic and religious thought who say that who have an evolutionary point of view. They see all faith, all religion as a part of cultural evolution. They're relativists, right? So one, for example, Fedotov, who has an anthology of Russian spiritual writing, Zernov, these kinds of people who are only Orthodox formally, but who are actually secularists and materialists, modernists. And so their point, their whole thing was that, well, Russia is unique, and Russian spirituality and the Russian soul is totally unique, and is different from Byzantium. It's different from the Greek Fathers, and this is totally false. The Russian spiritual tradition is in direct continuity with the first millennium of Orthodoxy, and so Konsevich's whole thesis is, and which is actually abundantly demonstrable, and which he demonstrates, is that the very roots of Russian civilization are in Orthodox Byzantium, are in the spiritual and theological tradition of the first millennium, and so this book is describing this bridge between the sacred Byzantium and Holy Russia. In the teaching, he gives a brief overview of the Orthodox spiritual teaching from the first millennium, and then he goes into the lives of the early Russian saints. It's very hard to find a hard copy of this book, but I've got a link to an online source here if you can't find a hard copy of the book. It's one of those cases where you go on Amazon and they want $300 for a little paperback book. But Konsevich's work is very important. We hope it'll be reprinted one day. And then this lovely book, originally put together by Father Seraphim Rose back in the 70s, published at Platina by St. Herman Press. It's still in print. It's like a third or fourth edition now. I don't know. It's still in print. Called the Northern Thebaid, Thebaid, Northern Thebaid. These are translations by Father Seraphim Rose of lives of the northern Russian ascetic saints, or great Russian ascetic saints, starting with St. Sergius in the 14th century and going up to the mid-17th century. In other words, the time leading up to that tragic time of the schism, of the reign of Nikon, and then the schism in the latter half of the 17th century. So now these lives, beautiful lives, first St. Sergius, St. Alexander of Sphira, St. Anthony of Sia, St. Paul of Obnora, St. Cyril of White Lake. I tear up, thinking about these people. And so these lives demonstrate in action, right? They demonstrate in action what Konsevich was describing in his theoretical book, right? So this is the workbook. Konsevich is a textbook. This is the workbook. Read these men. These men are doing the exercises, right? They're actually living it out. And also, if you can't get it, Konsevich's book, The Introduction to Northern Thebaid by Father Seraphim, is a good short summary, a substitute for Konsevich's book. It restates Konsevich's thesis, right? And the book, as I said, is still available from St. Herman Press. And I've got an order. I've been trying to find a copy printed in the early days of Platina in the 70s, and I've ordered one. I think it's one of those. I love the books that they printed at Platina in the 70s, because they did it on a hand press, and you can actually feel the imprint of the type on the page. It's such a different feel from books printed today that with using computer technology. Anyway, that's a little footnote. And then if we want to go on from the Northern Thebaid period, which ends in the 17th century, then to the 18th century, which is this dramatic period of the violent imposition of Westernization by the Petrine czars, right? But fighting against that is the seeds of spiritual renewal, right? Planted by St. Paisi Velichkovsky. So this is another out-of-print book from St. Herman Press. I mean, it's just a little monastery. You can't blame them for not reprinting everything, although I am going to blame them for not reprinting certain things because of a political agenda or ideological agenda. But in this case, it's just they probably just don't have the resources to keep reprinting all these books. But there's this life of St. Paisi Velichkovsky, and find one wherever you can. Just go online and hunt for hard copies. I cannot find an online version where you can go online and access it, download a PDF. I don't know where to find one. But St. Paisi in the 18th century was the key figure in reviving the hesychastic tradition that brought about the 19th century spiritual flowering in Russia. Right. So St. Paisi is from Poltava in Little Russia, or Ukraine, and he flees the Russian Empire to flee first of all, this dry kind of scholastic education they were giving him in the justifiably famous school in Poltava, but still, westernized school in Poltava. And he goes into to Wallachia, and he becomes a disciple of an elder in Wallachia. Wallachia is, of course, part of present-day Romania. And the elder Basil of Poiana Marului. And so you can try to find whatever you can, dig up whatever you can, read whatever you can about Paisi Velichkovsky. And also there's a book of the teachings of his elder, Basil, of Poiana Marului, and that's available from St. John of Kronstadt Press, and copies of that are still available from St. John of Kronstadt Press, the teachings of Elder Basil, who was the elder of Paisi Velichkovsky. Okay. And then also another 18th century work, or a source for an 18th century spiritual portrait, is the life of the elder Zosima of Siberia, another out-of-print book from Platina. But I think I found copies for sale online. The Life of Elder Zosima of Siberia. Now, this book is beautiful for a couple of reasons. One is that it shows that this Hesychastric tradition, though it kind of went underground in a sense, it was still quite present in Russia, even in the 18th century, even in the depths of the attack of the government upon the monasteries, the closing of monasteries, confiscation of monastery lands, terrible laws preventing young and healthy people from joining monasteries, all kinds of, terrible attacks upon monasticism and true orthodoxy by the post-Petrine emperors and empresses. And yet at the same time, there's still this great monastic life going on in the nooks and crannies, right, in the dens and caves of the earth and the corners of the empire. And but the life of Elder Zosima is not only good for showing this strict hesychastic or monastic life going on in the 18th century, it's also good as and perhaps even more important is the portrait of his family, the members of his family who were not monks, and how they lived, and the edifying life of these minor nobility who lived an extraordinarily pious life. And so you see it even in and these were Niconians, right? These are not old believers. They belonged to the new rite, to the official church, but they were leading the traditional patriarchal pious life of Holy Russia, and it's a very edifying book. Okay, then of course there's the great Seraphim of Sarov, and of course there's this a very important, I might say, pivotal or seminal document called The Conversation of Saint Seraphim with Motovilov, Motovilov, The Conversation of Saint Seraphim with his disciple Motovilov on the aim of the Christian life, or on the acquisition of the Holy Spirit. And it's available entire online at the orthodoxinfo.com website. Here, Saint Seraphim, who reposes in 1833, actually the same year as Elder Zosima, restates the fundamental wisdom described by Kontsevich, and the fundamental wisdom lived by the lives of the northern Thebaid saints, the fundamental wisdom recovered by Saint Paisi, and the publication of the Philokalia. Various versions of the life of Saint Seraphim are available, including a good, short, and readable version in Dr. Kavarnos' series, Dr. Konstantin Kavarnos. This is it's published by the Institute for Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies in Massachusetts. And I think it's volume 2 is his Life of Seraphim. So it's mostly saints from the Greek-speaking lands, but he does publish this. He did write this Life of Saint Seraphim, or translate and edit this Life of Saint Seraphim of Sarov. So also there are sayings of Saint Seraphim published by St. Herman Press in their Little Russian Philokalia series, which are available. Okay, so Saint Seraphim, who's like one of the great early monastic saints, come back to life, an Anthony the Great, or Macarius the Great, but in modern times, right, reposing in 1833. So we see that this, despite the problems of the 18th century, this incredible continuity of the true Orthodox, the true hesychastic, monastic, and spiritual tradition, which is not something just for monks, but which then spreads out and influences and colors the entire society of pious people in their time, right? So this is the true history of Russia. And of course, the 19th century is to a great extent dominated by the towering figures of the Optina elders, Optina Monastery, which from 1828 to 1928, 100 years, produced a series of God-bearing elders. And most of their lives, there are a lot of these elders, most of their lives are available from St. Herman Press. And but the lives of the elder Joseph, who reposes in 1910, and elder Moses, who to a great extent was the archimandrite who's responsible for pulling this whole amazing project of Optina together, who reposed in, I believe, 1861. Their lives, St. Joseph and St. Moses, you have to get from Holy Transfiguration Monastery in Boston, and the other lives are available in English from St. Herman Press. So Optina was not only the center of holiness in 19th century Russia, not the only center, but the most prominent or obvious center of holiness in 19th century Russia, but it is also the best known and most, it's not the only one, but it's the best known and most influential. And what happened at Optina, what happened because of Optina, is a microcosm of what is best in this entire period of this flowering of spiritual life in 19th century Russia. And it goes from the post-Paisi period, right, the period right after Paisi Velichkovsky, with Elder Leonid coming to Optina in 1828, all the way up to the Bolshevik Revolution and the last elders, Nikon and Nektari, being confessors and martyrs under the Bolshevik yoke. Okay. Also, a figure associated with Optina is Kireevsky, or the Kireevsky brothers, Ivan and Peter Kireevsky. And remember, earlier on we recommended a book called A Man is His Faith by Father Alexei Young about Ivan Kireevsky, who's a 19th century Slavophil philosopher who worked closely with the elder Makary of Optina to publish Orthodox spiritual literature. Okay. And so this book, A Man is His Faith, is available from St. John of Kronstadt Press. And then, of course, in the 19th century, speaking of Optina, we had this wonderful book, also from St. Herman Press, called The Love of God. In an earlier version, it was called One of the Ancients, but they expanded it, edited it, re-edited it, and so forth, and republished it as the love of God. But it's the life of the elder Gabriel of Pskov and Kazan, or of the Seven Lakes Monastery. The Elder Gabriel was a novice from Optina, and I'm mentioning him now because he's another bridge to the 20th century, because he reposes in 1915. So he starts his monastic life at Optina. He leaves Optina, right, which is a monastic paradise, and he goes on to be a monk in monasteries in Moscow, which are just terrible places, right? So his life, I love this life of Father Gabriel because it's just so down to earth. It doesn't cover up his weak points. It doesn't cover up the weak points of the Russian church life of that period. At one point, the monks in Moscow tried to poison him and kill him and drive him. They drove him out, and all kind of things go on. Real things. He's a real person, and it's an amazing book. It's one of my favorite books, and in his later life, he was supported very much by St. Elizabeth, the new martyr, the Grand Duchess. And so he reposes in 1915, and that brings our historical path right up to the era of the Revolution, right? Also, regarding the 19th century, I've often mentioned Ignatius Bryanshinov and Theophan the Recluse, right? And Bishop Ignatius Bryanshinov, who reposes in 1869, he wrote in his retirement, or his reclusion at the end of his life, he wrote a 5-volume series of his ascetical treatises, and for years we only had the Arena, which is volume 5, which is intended primarily for monks, but now a deacon named Nicholas Kotar is translating the other books in the series one by one, and so now Jordanville has issued volumes 1 and 2, and also we still have volume 5, which is the Arena. So look up Ignatius Bryanshinov and look up anything by Theophan the Recluse, right? Path to Salvation, Unseen Warfare, and so forth and so on. These two men, Father Seraphim Rose refers to these two repeatedly you'll see references to Ignatiy Branchinov and Theophan the Recluse by Seraphim Rose. He says these are our two, as Optina is our center of spiritual life, these two men are these two great bishop recluses, kind of in the tradition of St. Tikhon of Zadonsk, right, the great 18th century bishop recluse, who are, to use a contemporary word, an interface, right, between the monastic wisdom and then people in the world, because these men were in constant correspondence with worldly people, or not worldly in a pejorative sense, but people living in the world. And their writings are just amazing. Their writings are an epitome or a summary of the Russian spiritual achievement in the 19th century. So you can't go wrong with Ignatiy Branchinov and Theophan the Recluse. Then, of course, coming right up to the 20th century, we have the amazing figure, the unbelievable figure, the miraculous figure of St. John of Kronstadt, Father John Ilyich Sergiev, Ivan Ilyich Sergiev, St. John of Kronstadt, who was a pastor at the same church for, like over 50 years. And Kronstadt, which is, those of you who don't know, Kronstadt is the naval base, and still is the naval base of St. Petersburg. It's one of the main Russian naval bases. And like port cities, naval bases, cities dominated by naval fleets or merchant marine fleets, it was a rough place. And he was an amazing priest who worked countless miracles. He kept a journal. No matter how tired he was, he would make time every day to write down his thoughts and reflections in a journal, which was published as a book called My Life in Christ. My Life in Christ. And it's still available. I much prefer the old translation by Guliev to the new translation by Nicholas Kotar. And if you can find Guliev's translation, I recommend it. Sorry, Nikki, I'm sorry, but, Guliev's better. You should have left it the way it was. But Jordanville is publishing Deacon Nicholas Kotar's translation, My Life in Christ, in a 2-volume format. And there's the old 1-volume format in English, translation by Guliev, who was a Russian diplomat who translated it from Russian to English in the early 20th century. There's also now The Life of St. John by Sursky, which is by I.K. Sursky, which is a pseudonym of a writer who knew St. John personally, and he published his life in the 30s when he was in the Russian immigration in Yugoslavia. And but now it's finally been translated into English, and it's available from Holy Transfiguration Monastery in Boston. So you go to Boston Monks. I think their address is bostonmonks.org. And Holy Transfiguration Monastery in Boston. Go to their bookstore. Life of St. John of Kronstadt by Sursky, Sursky. And so you can read My Life in Christ, read the life of St. John of Kronstadt. And then there's a study, an academic study by a Russian Orthodox laywoman who's a professor of history, named Nadezhda Kitsenko. She's actually the daughter of a priest, the late Father Boris Kitsenko. And it's called A Prodigal Saint, Father John of Kronstadt and the Russian People. Now, if you read Dr. Kitsenko's book, remember this is an academic study. Even though she's a pious, believing Orthodox and daughter of a priest, she's also an academic historian. So the book was written as an academic book. And when the book came out in the first decade, I forget what exact year, first decade of the 2000s, I forget what year it came out. A lot of people didn't like it because they said, well, it wasn't pious, because it would show St. John's rough side. Like, especially earlier in his priesthood, he had some unhealed passions. I mean, he had some problems and some rough behavior. And also it paints, and sometimes it's a very unflattering picture of Russian society, because the book is real. It's about real people who really went on. And I actually, personally, I love this book. I love this book because I love St. John of Kronstadt so much. He was such an inspiration to me. And My Life in Christ, when I was ordained, the bishop who ordained me gave me a copy of My Life in Christ. And his inscription was, to Father Stephen Allen, on the day of your consecration to the priesthood, for daily reading. And that was my seminary, really. I didn't have a chance to go to seminary. I was already married and had many obligations. Didn't get to go to Orthodox seminary for my ordination. So my seminary was reading My Life in Christ. So I was very dedicated. I was very, very absorbed in the whole spiritual mind of St. John of Kronstadt. And then this book comes out in the 2000s, and one would think, well, you'd be offended by it, right? But I wasn't. I just love this book because, as one of my brother priests said, hagiographies, traditional hagiographies, describe a saint as a saint, thoroughly, completely as a saint, which is, of course, correct and proper and canonical. But a study like this shows the nuts and bolts of how a man becomes a saint. That's really, a great thing. So, if you're easily offended by reading nitty-gritty details of the life in the life of a man that you know is a saint, well, don't read it. I mean, nobody has to read it. And I saw a beautiful interview with Dr. Kitsenko, and she was talking about being torn, as a pious Orthodox, not wanting to talk about the rough edges of a saint, but then as an academic historian, having to be honest. But finally she said, and this is very touching to me because I'm a priest with children, and she said, well, finally my criterion was, is this a book that my father could read? That she didn't want her daddy, her papushka, to be offended, by the book. And so it's a beautiful book, My Prodigal Saint by Nadezhda Kitsenko. So St. John of Kronstadt is an apocalypse in himself. He's apocalypse meaning a revelation, right, in himself. We're talking about being apocalyptic. What's apocalyptic? A revelation, right? So St. John of Kronstadt is an apocalyptic figure. He's a revelation of the power of the Christian faith, the apostolic life coming into our own times. I mean, the man was an ascetic, a wonder worker, a pastor, a teacher, a missionary, a philanthropist, cared for the poor. You name it. He had the whole package. And he's the last and greatest prophet, so to speak, to take a title of the St. John the Forerunner. It's sort of applied to this new John of Kronstadt. He's the last and greatest prophet to warn of the revolution of the 20th century. So he combined a strict spiritual life with apostolic mission and miracle working. But now here's a point that a lot of people are not going to like, and I might get pounded for this, but I'm going to say it. St. John of Kronstadt was a completely consistent, outspoken, unapologetic, consistent monarchist, and what in today's terms what would be called far-right nationalist. St. John was a very consistent monarchist, and what would today the mainstream would call a far-right nationalist. He was a member of a group called the Union of the Russian Nation, Soyuz Ruskого Naroda. This word narod, meaning nation, is related to the like our English word nation, which is related to the Latin word for birth or giving birth. A narod means the people who share your birth. They share your DNA, right? It's not just some abstraction. A nation is people who have the same blood flowing in their veins, all right? And he was a member of the Union of the Russian Nation, which is an association of the Russian people that was fighting the revolution at the beginning of the 20th century. They were especially energized by the events of the 1905 revolution to realize this is an emergency situation. We have to band together. We have to fight these non-Russian and non-Orthodox conspirators and the people who own the media, the people who were dominating the intelligentsia, the foreign capital coming in from New York and the city of London and so forth to fund non-Russian and non-Christian groups of a different ethnic group and religious group who were engineering what was going to become the Bolshevik Revolution. And these men were unapologetic monarchists and nationalists, and St. John was right in there with them. He was right in there with them, okay? He's a great one. There's no one. You will not find a liberal or left-leaning or humanistic clergyman who is a saint. You will not find one who is a saint. All the saints of 20th century Russia are nationalists and monarchists. And what does that tell you, right? that orthodoxy is a thoroughgoing worldview. It's not just dogmatic beliefs. It's not just a spiritual practice or the purely ecclesiastical aspect of life. It is all of life, right? And so St. John, and if you don't believe St. John was a member of the Russian National Union, I'll send you a photograph of his membership card, right? And St. John was persecuted not only by the non-Christian revolutionaries, but persecuted by liberal clergy, liberal forces in the Russian church itself. And these same liberals came out of Russia, they go to Paris, and they come to St. Vladimir Seminary in New York, and they republish bits and pieces of St. John's writings and leave out the uncomfortable stuff they don't like because it condemns them, right? St. John was a literal confessor in that he actually suffered. When you read Sorsky's book, you'll see there's an episode in toward the end of his life, around the 1905 revolution, where he was taken and physically tortured by revolutionaries. A little known, to most people, an unknown episode in his life. All right. So St. John was a thoroughgoing monarchist, nationalist. But in today's terminology, he'd be considered far, far, far right-wing. So, my dear friends, if any of you are tempted to condemn those far-right nationalists, just remember, our great saint, St. John of Kronstadt, was a far-right nationalist. So when you're condemning them, you're condemning him. Okay. So, to sum up, we have to immerse ourselves thoroughly in the lives and teachings of these saints to have the right lens through which to view Russian history properly, from God's point of view, from the Orthodox point of view, right? We have to immerse ourselves and adopt their way of seeing everything, their way of perceiving everything, to view Russian history in general and the events of the Revolution and 20th century and 21st century Russian church divisions and so forth and controversies in light of the way the saints see things. And if you really acquire their mindset, it will be obvious to you that only a thoroughgoing monarchist, nationalist, and patriarchal political, social, and family philosophy, combined with uncompromising traditional orthodoxy, only this expresses the comprehensive vision of the true Holy Russia. The holy new High Martyr Vladimir of Kiev said that all the good clergy were monarchists, and that a Republican, not a Republican with a big R, I'm not talking about American politics, I'm talking about a Republican with a small r, someone who wants to replace the monarchy with a secular democratic state, right? Holy New High Martyr Vladimir of Kiev says that all the good clergy, every one of the good clergy he knew were monarchists, and all the bad clergy were Republicans, and that a Republican cannot be a good clergyman. You cannot be a true, pious, good Orthodox clergyman if you are not a monarchist and a nationalist. I'm not saying, it's not Father Stephen talking. I'm talking about St. John of Kronstadt. I'm talking High Martyr Vladimir of Kiev, all right? If anybody wants to come at me and say, hey, don't talk to me, go talk to them, right? Any other synthesis that tries to combine orthodoxy with some modern liberal democratic outlook, okay, is a distortion created by a pick-and-choose approach of modernists and secularists, including professors in Orthodox seminaries, sadly, who serve the spirit of the Antichrist. And I think most of you probably know some of the names I'm talking about. Without naming names, I'll say professors in modernist Orthodox seminaries who write books that try to combine orthodoxy with a secularist, modern liberal democratic outlook, and it does not work. It's a monster. It's not truth. Okay, it's not reality. So, getting on to understanding the Bolshevik Revolution, recall that in our survival course, we have characterized the entire period from 1789 and the beginning of the French Revolution until now as the Age of Revolution. You could also call it the Age of the Spirit of Antichrist, which followed the Age of St. Constantine. Saint Seraphim, Saint Seraphim, not Saint Seraphim, Father Seraphim, and this whole idea of Father Seraphim being a saint, that's another big subject. We can talk about that sometime. No, I don't call him a saint. He's a great and good man, but I wouldn't call him a saint. Anyway, that's a topic for another time. It's neither here nor there. Father Seraphim Rose explores the roots of the revolution, especially in his lecture 6. Go back to that PDF. If you don't have it, write me a note, and I'll send you the PDF of Father Seraphim's, the transcriptions of his Orthodox Survival Course lectures. His lecture 6 on the French Revolution. And Father Seraphim does not shy away from the role of the secret societies, the Illuminati, the Masons, and so forth. So if any of our liberal Orthodox friends tell you, oh, don't talk about these secret societies, don't talk about these conspiracy theories, blah, 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 listen. Father Seraphim Rose is just representing an entire tradition of serious Orthodox writers going back to the 18th century that are talking about the reality of these secret societies. Okay? And the Bolshevik Revolution is then we come to the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917, 1918. This is the pivotal moment, a pivot, right? A move from one position to another, a pivot. The Bolshevik Revolution is the pivotal moment in the ongoing revolution, the pivot from the end of the Constantinian era to the beginning of this now, what we have now, the unfettered rule of the globalist Luciferian elite. I say when unfettered, of course that's in a relative sense. Of course, everything is under God's sovereignty and providence. But from the earthly point of view, the unfettered rule of the globalist Luciferian elite. Why? Why is this the pivotal moment? It's the pivotal moment because it removes the greatest Orthodox power, the katekon. Okay, now this is an important term. This katekon is a Greek participle, meaning with the withholding one, either withholding thing or the withholding person. If you look at 2 Thessalonians 2, 6-7, this is the famous verse where St. Paul talks about the one who restraineth. He has the word twice. Once it's in the neuter and once it's in the masculine. So it's in the neuter, it's referring to the Orthodox polity, or the sanctified Roman dominion, the imperium, right, created in by the Constantinian era, right, whether in the Byzantine version or later the Russian version, or in any nationalist or monarchist Orthodox polity, right, is a katekon. So that when it's in the neuter, it's referring to the imperium considered as an institution. But then it's also in the same verse he uses it again as in the masculine. So that's the fathers say that's referring to the emperor, or to the God's anointed, right? The anointed royal power. So all the fathers interpret, the consensus of the fathers is to interpret this verse as referring to the imperial Christian authority, or the royal Christian authority, whether in the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire, or the Russian version of the Roman Empire, or in general to the Christian rulers, true Christian monarchs who rule in the various Christian nations. Okay, so when this is removed, St. Paul says, then the period of Antichrist will begin. So now, right now, in our Faith Comes First section of our course, we're focusing on the church. Later, we're going to return to Bolshevism when discussing family and society. Remember, our three great themes are going to be church, family, and society. Right now, the Faith Comes First section we're in now is about the church. And we're going to return to Bolshevism and communism and so forth when discussing family and society. But now we're focusing on discerning where is the church. Remember, that's our big question right now. How do we discern where is the church? And therefore our focus will not be on Russia as a whole, but specifically on the Russian church, the Moscow Patriarchate, the Russian church abroad, whether the Russian church abroad now absorbed by the Moscow Patriarchate, or the small Russian groups that are opposing the Moscow Patriarchate, or the Russian church abroad during its glorious period when it was the Church of Russia, at least on the public stage. And the Catacomb Church of Russia, which does exist, right, and so forth. So we're going to focus on the Russian church. But to discern where is the church, to understand the divisions in the Russian Orthodox ecclesiastical sphere, we do have to have a basic understanding of the Russian, or rather the anti-Russian revolution, right? They call it the Russian Revolution. Again, it's a typical establishment term, right? The Russian Revolution, like blame the Russians. Of course, there are Russians to blame, and they bear the greater blame because they should have known better. They shouldn't have collaborated. But the reality is that the so-called Russian Revolution was an anti-Russian revolution, a coup engineered by people who were not Russian ethnically and who are not Christian religiously. And it was financed from abroad, from the relatives of these same, or the co-religionists of these same people who were headquartered in the Anglosphere, in England and in New York. So we have to, so to understand the Russian Church in the 20th century, we do have to have some basic understanding of this anti-Russian Bolshevik revolution and its spiritual significance. Now, as a general principle of discernment, we can adopt this approach. I'm going to say something important right now. So this is a principle of discernment. To discern where the true Church of Russia is, you have to discern which hierarchy or hierarchies, because of today's chaotic situation, it might be hierarchies who are spiritually and ontologically one, but not administratively one at this moment. To discern where the true Church of Russia is, you have to discern which hierarchy or hierarchies of the Russian Church most thoroughly reject the revolution whole and entire without compromise in all of its manifestations and throughout all of its history until now. I'm going to say this again. To discern where the true Church of Russia is, you have to discern what hierarchy or hierarchies most thoroughly reject the revolution whole and entire without compromise in all of its manifestations and throughout all of its history until now. An absolute reset. Everything since 1917 has been a gigantic mistake. We've got to renounce all of it. Period. Okay. Anything after 1917 that is new, that is truly Soviet, is bad. Period. Okay. But what's going on now in mainstream Russian conservatism? Now, I'm talking about the liberals, the obvious tools of the anti-Orthodox forces. But what's going now in mainstream Russian conservatism, the kind that's popular, the people who are looking to today's Russia, Putin's Russia, as the great savior, the great bulwark of traditionalism. But what's really going on is not a thorough rejection of the Soviet period. That's obvious, right? It's not a thorough rejection of the Soviet period in all of its manifestations, but a new synthesis of orthodoxy with Sovietism. This is shown in the ecclesiastical realm by the supposed reconciliation of the Surgeonist approach with the confessional approach. So the Surgeonist approach is the approach of Metropolitan Sergius, who said, let's let the Church serve the interests of the Soviet power in order to preserve the Church institution, even if it means sending martyrs to their death, or it's compromising the faith to save the institution. And then there's the confessional approach, which is the martyrs who said, no, we're not going to compromise, we're just going to go to our deaths. Now, historically, traditionally, up till the time of Metropolitan Sergius, the Church always taught, well, there's one approach. When faced with compromising the faith or death, you take death, right? I'm not saying everybody's strong enough to do that. I'm not saying that I would do that. I'm just saying that's a teaching of the Church, right? But now, what we have now in the neo-conservative or neo-traditional Moscow Patriarchate ideology is that there are two paths to salvation. There's the path of the martyrs, and there's the path of compromise, and both are blessed by God. Okay, so that's a novel teaching, all right? So that synthesis, that reconciliation of these two approaches is novel, and it's an aspect of this neocon or neoconservative so-called Russian traditionalism, which is really a synthesis of orthodoxy with the Soviet mind and the Soviet accepting the Soviet reality. Okay. Then in the political realm, we have the political reading of 20th century history dominated by the Great Patriotic War, the Great Patriotic War ideology, meaning World War II, of course, and that somehow the Red Army, which is a satanic organization, right, which committed countless horrific crimes, and the Red Army, which is an instrument of the Soviet power, right, instrument of Stalin, that somehow this Red Army is sanctified and hallowed, has an aura of holiness around it, because it saved Europe from the fascists. there's a whole psychosis, a spiritual psychosis built around this great patriotic war ideology, when in fact the real heroes of Orthodoxy were the Russians who fought the Soviets, right? Von Panvitz's Cossacks, or General Vlasov's army, and so forth, are the real heroes. But this gets all flipped around, right, and twisted to this, and these men are regarded as the villains, are anti-Russian, and the real pro-Russians are the Soviets. So the Bolshevik Red Army becomes this great holy crusade against the boogeyman of Hitler and fascism, right? So we have to reject this reading whole and entire. We have to reject surgeonism, or this idea of two paths. There's martyrdom, then there's compromise, and both are paths to salvation, which is really weird, right? It's totally opposed to the whole history of the church. And we have to oppose this as honest people who want to understand reality. We have to oppose this whole great patriotic war ideology, which somehow, Lenin and Stalin did bad things, but the great patriotic war kind of hallows the whole Soviet experience. It makes it all right, and we have to oppose this. Now, I'm not talking about judging anyone morally. I'm not talking about judging Patriarch Sergius or Metropolitan Sergius morally. I know Patriarch Sergius is in hell. I wouldn't say something like that. But what happens is this: critics of the uncompromising anti-Sergianist position. So, say we take an uncompromising anti-Sergianist position. No, you're not supposed to compromise the faith to save your skin or to save buildings. You have to just, suck it up and confess the faith. We just have to say is the truth, and I guess if I have to die for it, I hope God gives me the grace to die for it. I don't have the strength to die for it, but if God gives me the grace, glory to God, and I'll confess the faith. All right. So you say, well, that's our position. And then people come back at you and say, well, how dare you judge? If you had been in Metropolitan Sergius' position, you would have done the same thing. Well, I fully admit I could have done the same thing. I'm worthless. All right. But so we're not judging Sergius or anybody who took the Sergian compromised position morally. I'm not saying I know that they're bad people, I'm a good guy, and they're going to go to hell and I'm going to paradise. We're just trying to form an intellectual, moral, and theological position. Or we're trying to form our intellectual, moral, and theological positions on the basis of which to make informed choices. So this emotional stuff about don't judge Patriarch Sergius is it's a red herring, right? It's a disabling tactic by people who don't want to discuss the issues. They want to discuss personalities or moral judgments rather than the issues. Okay, so for example, I can honestly say Metropolitan Sergius' statement on 1629 July 1927 that the joys and sorrows of the Soviet power are the joys and sorrows of the Orthodox Church, I can say that is a profound error. But that doesn't mean I'm saying I know that Sergius is condemned by God to eternal punishment for making this statement. Right? Those are two different things. So we have to keep these things distinct, not get disabled by that false argument. So, how do we get started? Now, we've been talking now for nearly an hour and a half. So how do we get started reading about the revolution and the church, the Orthodox Church vis-a-vis the revolution? Okay. So earlier we gave a course of reading about the Russian church leading up to the revolution, but now what about reading about the revolution in light of orthodoxy? So to read about the church and its response to the revolution, the first must-read book, this book really should be first on your list, is Russia's Catacomb Saints by I.M. Andreev, another I.M., where we had I.M. Kunsevich, now we have I.M. Ivan Mikhailovich Andreev, A-N-D-R-E-Y-E-V, I.M. Andreev, and Father Seraphim Rose. Father Seraphim finished, Andreev's work is about the first third of the book, and then Father Seraphim collected martyrs' lives from different sources and translated them and put it all together to this book. Now, this book was published by St. Herman Press in the early 1980s, but it's never been reprinted. And the present management, shall we say, at St. Herman Monastery said they're going to rewrite the book. They told people I know have called them. They said that we have to rewrite the book because there are errors. Well, they're going to rewrite the book to justify their belonging to World Orthodoxy, right? The book was written when the Russian Church abroad was separate from World Orthodoxy, or distant, shall we say, from World Orthodoxy, and and Father Seraphim, and Andreev himself, and Father Seraphim give an uncompromising anti-surgeonist interpretation to all these events. And so St. Herman and their present, St. Herman 2.0 or 3.0, right? They haven't reissued the book because they'd be condemning themselves out of their own book, right? So, but when they do, if they do ever come out with it again, expect them to omit or distort a lot of the author's original statements about the Catacomb Church versus the Soviet Patriarchate, right? So if Russia's Catacomb Saints, I'm warning you ahead of time, if St. Herman's reissues it, they're going to be airbrushing and cutting and pasting a lot of stuff, because you could not read this book and then justify the Russian Church Abroad's capitulation to the Soviet Patriarchate that occurred in 2007, or St. Herman Monastery belonging to the Serbian Patriarchate, for that matter. So the Russian, you can't justify the Russian Church Abroad joining the Moscow Patriarchate or St. Herman's joining the Serbian Patriarchate once you've read this book in its original form. Okay. Now there are minor factual errors in Russia's Catacomb Saints simply because they didn't have some information. For example, the most obvious example is that they thought that Father Michael Rojdestvensky had reposed along with his brother Father Ismail. Father Ismail had reposed, had died during the persecutions. It turns out, later we found out that Father Michael had survived. I actually met spiritual children of Father Michael in the 1990s, right? Elderly people who've been because he lived right up, I think, to the 1970s. He lived to be 99 years old. So we didn't know this, right? Then we found out later, Father Michael was still alive. He didn't die with Father Ismail. So read the book and it says, well, Father Ismail and Father Michael both died in the persecutions. Well, it turns out, okay, that's a minor factual adjustment, right? But that's not what St. Herman's is talking about. What they're talking about is they're going to rewrite the book to justify, they're going to airbrush a lot of Andreev and Seraphim Rose's opinions because it's embarrassing to them in their current ecclesiastical allegiance. Okay. Now, it's hard to find actual copies of this book, but you can find links to downloading it online from two different sites. And both of those sites are listed at Russia's catacombsaints.blogspot.com. I've got the URL in the notes, which are going to be published in my blog. So you can get busy reading Russia's Catacomb Saints. So that's your assignment. You have a long assignment. You don't have to read all of that early reading list before you go to Russia's Catacomb Saints. If you want to go to Russia's Catacomb Saints right away, because right now we're concerned about the current situation, go to it. It's a beautiful book. It's going to change your life. It's changed the lives of many people. So Russia's Catacomb Saints. If you don't have a hard copy, can't find a hard copy, go online and get it. Start reading it. Do get started on Russia's Catacomb Saints. Next time we're going to discuss further reading. As I've said, to recap, to go back to an earlier theme in my talk today, I'm not a competent reader of Russian literature, and so I do value the work of men like myself who are native English speakers, but who've gone in and studied the Russian sources in the original. And there are writers that are very helpful to us. Now, I'm going to get pounded for this, but I have to recommend that you look into the writings of Dr. Matthew Rayfield Johnson and Dr. Vladimir Moss. Okay, Matthew Rayfield Johnson's site is rusjournal.org, rusjournal.org, and Dr. Moss's site is just search Vladimir Moss, and you'll pull the link to his site and start reading their articles. Now, I'm not saying I agree with these men about everything. Okay, now, part of being a grown-up, is that you can learn from men you don't agree with about everything. So I know I'm going to get pounded because they're going to say, well, Matthew Rayfield Johnson is a neo-Nazi and a racist and anti-Semite and all this kind of stuff. And they're going to say, well, Vladimir Moss is, they call him names and so forth and so on. I value my relationship. I value my relationship with both of these men. I think they're both brave and upright men, and they've done good work. They don't agree with each other on a lot of things. But why am I recommending these men? Because they have taken the trouble to go to original Russian sources And they have written articles and short books and so forth based on actual Russian sources, things that you're not going to get from the Baudelarized, westernized, liberalized, secularized pap you get from St. Vladimir's Seminary or sources like that. So go ahead and read them. You have to believe everything they say. You don't have to like everything they say. I'm just recommending them as just another source to get beyond the this curtain put up by mainstream academia and mainstream or establishment Orthodox so-called authorities about the history of the church in the 20th century and the history of Russia. Right? So get reading, get praying, and I look forward to speaking with you next time as we go further into our exploration of the Russian Revolution and the Russian Church in the 20th century.